Over the past 9 months, a handful of my builds have been World War II Deutsche Afrika Corps vehicles, and now is the time to integrate these into a desert diorama. So that means dusty vehicles, dusty figures, a building or two, a dusty roadway, and of course, large palms. Not palm trees, as my wife constantly reminds me that palms are not trees. So let's start building a World War II DAK diorama without trees. So since this diorama is being set in Tunisia in North Africa, the starting point is an African house. And thank you to Reality and Scale for this fantastic resin home. Now we're going to stick that down onto the base as a reference point, and then I'm carving out in large chunks the XPS foam here on the base to set the groundwork level. So just got to be careful with the knife I don't get a bit carried away and take my own finger out. But you can see here what I'm doing is I'm removing large chunks of the foam because I've got the VMS Smart Mud to set the base layer. Once that's dry, I can then trim up edges of the diorama base, which I'm using in 2mm balsa wood. With a hobby knife, just trimming that down to the same level as the base where the XPS foam is. Just being careful to make sure I don't dig too deep, and I'm going to work just slightly proud of the foam base there. Next step is to paint the edge black, and this is a really crucial point because if I leave that in its natural colour, I will tend to adjust all the colouring in the base to suit that natural colour. But now that I'm painting it black, which is the presentation face, you can see just how much that changes the colour tones that I'm really going to use. Into the AK sanding products. These sand products are fantastic. They're acrylic paste. I think a lot of us have probably used some of these AK pastes in the past, but here you can see I'm just mixing the drier edge after I've taken the lid off so that we get a consistent wetness to the product. Wetness is a technical term, obviously. And we're just going to mix that in with the brush that I'm going to use to apply it. Now, I'm not going to use a trowel or something similar because I don't want a flat finish. I want a textured finish here. So using a stiff bristled brush, I'm just going to dab this in and work it into the surface. The idea being that this will provide the base sand colour for the diorama. So stippling it in, I get some variation, which is really important. As you'll see in the next step right here, I'm going to use the same brush, all dry, just to push into the surface of the acrylic paste, which is not dry at this stage. It's been given about 20 minutes to firm up. And this process here gives it a sandy dusty kind of appearance. Now I've got the vehicles, or two of them actually, just sat in here. I can work the tracks in, get those details put in, put some rocks down. Then using some alcohol, I can squeeze those over just to relieve the surface tension, and using some diluted PVA glue here in the applicator, I can precisely apply that over the stones that I've got in there. The reason I'm doing it this way is I don't want to flood the surface entirely because it'll tend to fill up all of that texture that I've added. I really just want it to be enough to hold those stones down, and then we're going to come back over and individually paint those later on. Here you can see I'm going to add some grass tufts to the surface. Now I've very specifically chosen these ones because there's a lot of variation in the colour in these tufts. I'll pull these apart. I don't want to use really large ones, so if I separate these into 2 or 3 pieces, I can then, using a little super glue, apply those to the surface. They'll stick down, and I don't need to paint over these again. And that's actually a crucial step because I don't want to destroy the colour tones I'm getting from the sand texture and from the stone. Now I need to build a compound around the house, and just here I've got some pieces from Dump in Europe. Great little kit that we can use at a resin cast. So after applying primer, I'm just going to hand apply some paint colours onto the bricks. Now because this is North Africa, we're not going to be using European colours because the clay and sand textures in North Africa are clearly very different. So I'm using desert tones to paint the individual bricks. I'll later put an oil wash over the mortar between those and some of the cracks. It's clearly evident in these panel sections. After putting those panel sections and the block corners in, what I'm now doing is integrating them into the surface of the model. And to do that, I'm using that acrylic paste from AK. So here you can see with a finer brush, I can apply those into the corners. And then with a little water applied on the brush, we'll be able to adjust this so that we get a realistic integration. So here with that water, what I'm doing is I'm just washing that down into the lower corners, into those crevices. Coming back again with a bit more water. What we want to do is then turn the top of it that's left there as a smear against the wall. We want to turn that into a wash. So that gives us an integration of the right color tone for the dust that's settling into that lower portion of the wall. And we make our way along the wall, apply some more of the paste, a bit more water to integrate it in, and we'll play with that until we've got a satisfactory result. So once I've got those major elements in, I'm going to now use some 3rd gen acrylics in desert tones to go through and individually paint all of the stones that I've previously applied. This is a really important step because even though some stones will have a greyish tone to them, others won't. They're going to have some natural desert tones to them. So we want to integrate them correctly. And it's a matter of picking out colours that suit the tone that we've used throughout the entire diorama here. So, bit of variation. I'm probably using 4 or 5 tones in this. Some similar colours like Iraqi sand and desert earth. Now this house is going to need some power. You can't run electric devices obviously without it. And traditionally we'd use timber poles for doing power line poles. But in North Africa we're going to find that there's not a lot of long straight trees that are going to provide us with that timber that's required. So the alternative used there would be concrete, and that concrete would be an aggregate made up of what's available in the local area in many cases. So we're going to start with creating a concrete pole by doing what I'm doing here and dabbing on a mixture of, to me, a grey filler. Similar process to what we do if we're changing armour and scale on an armoured vehicle. Once that's dry, I'm going to drill in the holes for the posts which hold the power lines themselves. So rather than using an electric drill or a micro drill, I'm doing this using a much slower method because I have control over it and it won't snap my drill bits. So you can see, just using the pin vise, I just work my way across the top of the poles to put the appropriate holes in and then put in the guides straight after. So I push those in first just to make sure the hole's the correct size. Dab them in some CA glue and then push those in nice and firm. So once we get to this point, we now need to make some adjustments to make that look like concrete. So one of the important factors here is concrete really isn't just a grey colour. It's very much dependent on the soil and clay types that are used to make up the aggregate, and I'm just going to give this a wash, a very thin wash of Iraqi sand, just to shift the colour tone from that greyish colour to a little more of an earth tone. That's really important because a standard grey colour would look quite stark and stand out and really not look right to the naked eye. So let's just get this tone correct. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a wash over the top of that of a dark grey, almost black, that's been diluted out to around 10%. And I'm just going to literally slop it on all over. The purpose of doing this is not to shift the colour tone so much, but to add variation to the pole itself. It's a really important step because it adds a realistic touch to the appearance of the concrete, because concrete, again, if you look at concrete, is not consistent in its tone or colour throughout the entire batch. So once that's done, we then need to apply some speckled black and white paint over the surface. So this is going to replicate the bits and pieces that would just be thrown into the aggregate to give it strength. So in this case, it could be seashells, stones, anything unusual that gives the concrete some body. I can go back, as you see here, and just gently remove some of the odd shaped or oversized droplets that appear on the power poles. And just working those into the surface, I can blend the colour in and give it a little bit more variation. With the white, we've got to be a little more careful because it's quite stark. It'll stand out enormously, so we don't want to overdo it. I just want to get a few strong spots into it just to add that variation. So you can see here we're not using a lot of white. Certainly the darker tone stands out better. House in the desert. Where do they get water from? Well, in this case, we're going to give them a well. Going to be generous. So I've got this resin kit for the well, and we're just going to run around the outside of that after priming it and put in all the stone colours. Timber or wooden tones in here stand out very strongly against the sand colours, so we need to make sure that we get these as realistic as possible because they will catch the eye of the viewer. Much like the palm trees in this will. See, I said palm trees, this is the part where my wife's going to come in and kick me. The palms here stand out a lot because of that reddish tone. It's the same with the timber here, so getting the rust tones on these and the dust elements is really important. Next, we need to settle this into the diorama itself. So it's tucked into a corner behind a palm tree and behind the compound walls. What I'm doing here is just using some dry pigments just to fill in the little gap between the ground and the well itself. And then just with a little bit of Mission Model's thinner, because it's an acrylic base, I'm just going to wet the area here and let that soak in, and that will hold the pigments down. I can then apply another layer of pigment direct over this when it's nearly dry, and because it still has that little bit of dampness from the thinner, that will help bind the dry pigments to the surface here. So as you can see, I'm just applying that in a controlled way. I won't dump a whole lot of dry pigment here because it won't have the ability to be absorbed into the thinner. We'll have to do that layer by layer, and there's probably 4 or 5 layers in doing that integration part. So once I've done that, I've got all the vehicles and the major elements set into the diorama, and I can stop and assess exactly where I'm at. I'm quite happy with it at this stage. The next part really is going to be putting in some small elements like the barbed wire, the bucket, the gates. And when I've done the gates, I've had to put in locking pins behind them. So I've made those from brass tube and brass wire. And next we move on to what's going to be the most significant element for this diorama, the figures. There are 3 stories being told in this diorama, but we'll get to that at the end. So let's have a look at how I paint figures. So my water carrier is slightly hidden in this diorama, but he's a great example of how I can integrate using acrylics and oil paints to very quickly paint up a figure. So let's go through that process. So I'm going to use the zenithal lighting technique, which requires a very strict application of shade and lighting areas. So first step, let's get some XF1 Tamiya flat black sprayed over the base primer. And it's really important here that we cover every part of the figure. It'll become a little bit more evident as we go along, but black is going to ensure that we have all of the shaded areas covered, because the next step is from above, which will be where the light source is coming, i.e. the sun. We're going to spray Tamiya buff. Now I don't use white because white's going to produce a really stark difference between the light and shadow areas. I like to use buff, particularly in a desert scene, because it gives an underlying tone to the paint that we're going to paint anyway, particularly for the uniforms and the skin. So you can see here the face is still black because of the brim of that hat. And all the areas of that would be exposed to the light now become much brighter. And we have an initial setting there for the shaded and light areas. So the next step is we're going to use some acrylic paints in the appropriate colours. With that paint, I'm going to produce very, very thin washes of paint, which I'm going to use to apply the colours of the uniform and the individual items on the soldier. So to do that, the paint will be thinned to around 5% paint to 95% water. I'm just going to wash that straight over the body of the uniform. And at the end of the day, we're probably going to apply 3, maybe 4 coats just to get some depth in there. What I don't want to do is I don't want to wash out the black shadow areas that we've used. The important part here is that, like all figure painting, I can come back over the highlight and shadow areas with different shades of the original colour that I've used on that piece of uniform, which is what I'm doing here. I'm just using a slightly lighter version of that wash and just running over the highlight areas just to bump up the opacity. Once I've got a good combination of paint washes over the clothing, I'll then start on the skin tones. So I'm using a mid skin tone here, give me a starting point because I can go lighter or darker from that where I need to for light or for shadow. And it just sets a base tone over the face, the arms, and in this case the exposed legs, because this particular soldier is wearing shorts. So I'm carefully just running that over the surface just to try and get an even coverage. Because I'm using acrylics, we just need to be careful that we don't leave tide marks anywhere. I'm just applying the paint in a nice even way. Here, using a leather tone, I'm just working over the belt and then go through and pick out all the little individual items on the figure and just get a base colour down on those. Again, the boots, just using that same leather colour. These tropical boots have a lower portion which is leather and a canvas upper. Again, it's just important that we take our time, just paint out the details that are necessary, because what I'm going to do is come back with different tones and apply weathering to each of those. So the first step after we've got all those base tones done is we're going to do all the skin tones. So I'm applying some lighter washes over the areas of the face, like the nose and the cheeks. If he didn't have such a large hat on, we'd be looking at doing the area above the eyebrows as well, because it reflects light quite well. And by doing this, I'm using a lot of different techniques, not just washing the paint over. Stippling's really important. And you can see here, there's just highlights that are just being pushed out. Just use oils to come over and give a wash of dirt and sweat and dust over his clothing. And you can see he's in an area that's going to be slightly hidden. I just want to push elements in this figure to be slightly unrealistic so that they stand out. Now with the rest of the figures, they've all been painted, so I'm going to now push those into the base, using a bit of PVA glue just to hold them in place. And you can see after I put the figures in, I have all the elements in the diorama. The only other work that I probably need to do at this stage is to go around and just make sure that the base of those figures, their boots, are integrated in well to the level of the ground, and any final touch-ups are done. Before I get to the final presentation, I'd like to give a big shout out to one of my favourite podcasts. The On The Bench crew are big supporters of this channel, and if you're looking for a great scale model podcast to listen to, the OTB team are top class, so check them out. Well, here is the completed diorama in all its glory. Let's take a moment to look at the elements that are within it. In the foreground we can see two large vehicles, a Panzer III and a 2-ton truck. The first element of the storyline is expressed in this scene. The Panzer has run out of fuel on the retreat to Tunis. The truck is providing a fuel resupply so that the Panzer can be brought back into service. As the truck's crew fill both the Panzer fuel tanks and jerry cans, we pivot to look at the next element in the diorama, reward. The company commander has taken this opportunity to award one of the Panzer crewmen with his Iron Cross. It is still hung around his neck, suspended on its ribbon. He and the company commander are celebrating by sharing some Italian wine that they have liberated from the Arab house. Then there is the third element to the diorama, retreat. To the right, in the foreground, we see the Panzer's commander and one of his senior NCOs. They are watching the road they have just travelled along to see if there are any Allied elements in close proximity following them. The run for Tunis is a race, as these troops are retreating to Sicily and the Italian mainland. So thank you for watching. If you've liked what you've seen, then please hit the like button to help promote the video so that others can also see it too. And until next time, take care, keep building your models, and maybe we'll meet soon to talk about this wonderful hobby.